Hey everyone, how's it going? Well, it is that time of year again. Like I said yesterday, it's time for videos on our top reads of the year. Yesterday, you saw a video from me about my top 3 rereads, and today you're going to see this video, which is about my top 5 nonfiction books of 2021. And I actually think it was a less strong nonfiction year than I usually like. The number of nonfiction books that truly blew me away and really were kind of paradigm shifts for me was, I think, lower than it usually is. I think a lot of the nonfiction that I read this year turned out to be pretty prosaic, turned out to be, perhaps informative, perhaps enjoyable, but nothing very earth-shattering, and that's fine, but it does make me think that it was a bit less of a strong nonfiction year than it was last year, where last year, my book of the year was a nonfiction book, whereas my book of the year this year is not a nonfiction book. So, anyway, that's not to be down on the 5 books in this video. These 5 books are the exceptions to that. They are books that were not only informative, but were written in brilliant style, and that did inform me in some way, that maybe weren't quite paradigm shifts, but were just brilliant in their way, on their subject matter, and that I thoroughly enjoyed reading and would recommend to basically anyone. So, coming in at number 5 is Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which is a tiny little book. It's barely 100 pages long, but it is both a thorough, despite the book's length, a thorough critique of the American prison system and what it does to non-white people, and also provides in its last chapter a plan for how to actually abolish prisons, a plan for how that could be accomplished. That isn't just ending prisons immediately, causing chaos. And to think that she accomplishes that, which you would think would take a much longer book, in such a short space, I think is so brilliant. And this is a book that I have referenced so much in conversation with other people, that I think back to so often when reading news articles and reading other books. So it's just great. I recommend it because it's so short, it's not going to take you any time at all. So that's number 5. Number 4 is a much longer book and is much more massive in scope, and that book is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight. This is obviously the life and times of Frederick Douglass as told by David Blight. And Frederick Douglass, obviously very famous, but for anyone who doesn't know who he is, he was born as a slave in the early 19th century, and he escaped from slavery, and he wrote about that experience in his most famous book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and then went on to become a famous orator, writer, autobiographer, and activist, and occasionally even politician. And this biography is such a great work. It's not only a really complete portrait of the man in all of his convictions, in what's best about him, and occasionally what's worse about him, but it's also really a history of the African-American experience in the 19th century, and that's something that I really appreciated about it, and which I learned a lot from. So if you're interested in Frederick Douglass, if you've read Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass and you want to learn more, I'd say that this is the place to go. So that is number 4. Number 3 is, again, a very, very short book. In fact, it's even shorter than Are Prisons Obsolete, is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, which I also posted a whole video about, so I will leave a link to that if I remember. And this is a series of letters that Rilke wrote to a younger man, kind of giving him advice on being a poet, and also just general life advice. And the only other book that I think I've ever gotten so much sort of life wisdom from in my life was The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. And there's just so much in this book about life and the universe and how to live life, and also how to be a writer and a poet, and about God and religion and all these things. And it's all discussed with so much eloquence and with so much insight, even though it's so very short. And so it is number 3. My number 2 favorite nonfiction book is The Lives of the Great Composers by Harold Schonberg, which is a collection of very short biographies of most of the great composers of the Western musical tradition, starting with Monteverdi, going through Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, all the way up to Philip Glass at the end, a composer who's still alive. And it's just such a delightful read. It's informative on the lives of the composers, on the personalities of the composers, on the works of the composers, on musical history. I really do think that this book functions really well as a history of Western music. If you want a crash course in that, I actually think this would be a great place to go. Even though I haven't really read any other books on that subject, I think that this does a good job of just giving an overview of the history of Western music. And it's also just a great series of character portraits of these composers, and it's fascinating in that way, and it does a great job too, I think, of connecting the lives of the composers with the works of the composers, not in a way that kind of fetishizes the influence of their lives on their work, as is sometimes done in the arts today, but just in a way that kind of shows you how what was going on in a composer's life informed the music that they wrote. And so it's just great. It just made my love of classical music kick into hyperdrive, and so now I'm listening to more classical music than ever. So that's number 2. And then number 1, my favorite nonfiction book of the year, is a history book, and it's another history about 19th century America, like the Frederick Douglass biography, and that is This Hallowed Ground by Bruce Catton. This is his 1-volume history of the American Civil War, and it is filled with eloquence and human insight that I haven't ever seen in a history book before. And I've seen that in a lot of history books. I read history, certainly, but I feel like this is the wisest history book I've read and the most eloquent one that I've read. And it's just a delight. It not only tells the overall story of the Civil War, but it also takes time to tell the stories of certain individuals in the war, even individuals who weren't Ulysses S. Grant or Abraham Lincoln. It tells stories about individual soldiers in the war. And Bruce Catton also does a great job of emphasizing the role of African Americans in the time of the Civil War, and shows that they were active agents in the Civil War, not just sort of passive people who, were emancipated or something. They were very much active, and not only the black men who served in the Union Army, but also slaves who escaped, and so on. And so it's just a great book. It's one of the only history books that I feel like I would reread just to re-experience the eloquence of it, and the storytelling ability of it, and the wisdom in it. Most history books, when I read them, I think that was great, but I'll probably never read it again, because what I would rather read is a different history book on the same subject. I would rather get a new perspective on the same subject. But this book, I would reread it just because it's eloquent and insightful, and yeah. So that's why it's my number 1 nonfiction book, and that's a wrap for this video. So let me know if you've read any of these books, if you like them or if you don't like them, and you will be seeing my video tomorrow on my top fiction books of the year. So talk to you then. Bye.